One of the experiences I trust every homebrewer shares is the feeling of awe that comes from witnessing the conversion of wort into beer through the fermentation process. Even after 15 years, I still get giddy when I see the first signs of airlock activity, a nice fluffy kreuzen developing on top of my beer. The worst is when this takes too long. You all know the anxiety that comes from checking on a batch a day after pitching and seeing no action. This is why we love Imperial Yeast, who pack 200 billion cells of the purest yeast into each pitch-right pouch, which assures quick starts, healthy fermentation, and predictably great results. I strongly urge all of our listeners to check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and let them know that you appreciate their support of the Brewlosophy podcast while you're at it. All right, on to the show. A couple defining characteristics of IPA are its uber hoppiness and its relatively high alcohol content. Now, while this is the perfect combination for many, those of us who prefer knocking more than a couple back in one sitting can struggle to, keep our footing after an IPA drinking session. Rather than resorting to crushable pale lagers or other low ABV styles that are typically more malt forward, brewers a few years ago began a trend of making beers that packed all of the hoppy goodness of a standard IPA, but with a fraction of the booze. You're listening to the Brewlosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and I'm joined by contributor Malcolm Frazer on this episode to talk about the style of beer that's come to be known as Session IPA.
The word session is kind of near and dear to me as a person who has at least heritage of English. My parents were born in England, or my father was, and my mom was raised there pretty much. I was born there but brought over here. But I just really identify with English beers, and one of the hallmarks of English beers are its sessionability.
Yeah,
both on strength and the meaning I take from the word is drinkability. So session beers tend to be weaker, lower ABV, but they should also not just be lower in alcohol. They should be, in my opinion, highly drinkable.
Yeah, and full of flavor. I mean, that's the big issue is trying to get these beers that are brewed to be weaker, to still have a nice full flavor. And I'm a fan of English beers as well. And part of the reason being is that they are lower ABV.
Yes, they should be flavorful, but they're not overly flavorful. They're not rich, because that would, in my opinion, once again, lower the sessionability of it.
Yeah. Well, I'm not entirely sure how it happened, but it seems like I've developed a bit of a reputation as an IPA hater, or at the very least someone who doesn't really appreciate the style as much as other people do. That really isn't the case at all. I love a good IPA. My problem with it is that they're usually so strong I end up zonked after drinking a few of them, so I end up choosing lower ABV beers when drinking with friends. When breweries like Firestone Walker and Founders started dropping these so-called session IPAs, I was really excited about it, and over the last few years, I've drank quite a few and recently brewed one up using some questionable methods. I'm looking forward to chatting with you about this arguably novel style, Malcolm. All right, if you like what we're up to and you want to keep us doing it, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy. By committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Our guest for this month is Richard Priest from Ontario, Canada's Escarpment Labs, who've really made a name for themselves over the last couple of years with all of their Kvike and sour strains. They also have traditional ale and lager strains available. Richard's going to be taking questions on Saturday, August 15th, 2020. So be sure to make your pledge by that Friday to get in on the action. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Learn more about becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who have an array of amazing purpose-built stainless brewing products to improve your brew day. If you're looking for a high-quality pilot brewery, make sure to check out the gorgeous BH15 single-tier system. It comes with a hard plumb manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brew process. Head over to brewershardware.com to see what they're all about, and make sure to mention Brewlosophy at checkout so they give you a free gift. Again, that's brewershardware.com. Listener Brad Ashton wrote in with an interesting idea I think other people might appreciate. I was excited about the latest experience episode on cleaning and sanitation, as I've often wondered about many of the topics we discussed on that show. One tip I have relates to the drying of tubing. I hold one end of the tube up to the inlet of my shop vac and let it run for a minute. Holding it so that my hand mostly seals the inlet creates a decent amount of suction, which pulls ambient air through the tubing and dries the inside of it very quickly. I absolutely love this idea. And I have a shop vac. I'm surprised I never thought of this. Wet tubing is one of those things that definitely worries me when I'm going to hang it up in my garage. Just the risk of mildew or mold growing in there. That's why I spin it over my head like a helicopter. But the shop vac thing sounds pretty clever and maybe a bit safer than spinning it over my head.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. I kind of do the swirly whirly thing too. I kind of get it, spin it a few times and then I hang it on a hook so that each side drips down so it has no dead spots in it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and when we were talking on that episode, the tubing thing, I could have spent so much more time on it because that to me is one of the biggest vectors for potential contamination for people who are, maybe don't have a way to hang up their tubing. If you just let that stuff sit, especially if it's warmer outside, you'll get mildew in your tube. I've had it happen multiple times. So anyways, Brad, I think it's a really clever idea to use your shop vac for that, and I'm going to have to give it a shot. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. A while ago, back before intentionally hazy IPA was really a thing, brewers over here on the West Coast began experimenting with ways to maximize the hop character in their beer while maintaining some balance, which ultimately led to the development of a style now known as double IPA. And one of the most popular commercial examples is Russian River's Pliny the Elder. Previously rather difficult to come by, even here in California, with the opening of the second brewery in Windsor, California, distribution has increased, which has been awesome. They're now on the shelves here in Fresno, and so I have ample access to Russian River beers. Well, I snagged a bottle of this very highly acclaimed Pliny the Elder to share with my friends.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Smells like an IPA.
Oh my God, you're right.
For once, it's probably Coors Light.
It's been like 7 years since we were learned. And
Since the last time I was right. Ooh, 100% juniper right there. Yikes. It's not me. Jersey, this is right up your alley, though.
I have not tasted it. I have not sniffed it.
What about the beer?
I'm going to take a sniff. IPA, like you said. Piney.
Oh, very.
Piney the Elder. It's a Piney the Elder.
Because it's not the younger, it's the elder?
No, the younger has got this. It doesn't matter. Oh, that's good. Okay, so you've witnessed my departure from both religion and IPAs.
In the same night.
You were there. No, not the same night. Because I was a big IPA fan for a long time, and I fell it away. But this is good. This, I swear to Jeebus and all that is holy, is Pliny the Elder.
I believe whatever you say about it, because this is not me at all.
Then let's house it. That's Pliny the Elder. I tasted it.
I don't like it. I've had worse.
I wasn't even joking. You fed this to me a while back. We were learning, man.
I'm going to go with a 5. What are you going to give it, Jersey?
Well, we already know what it is. We can't rate it. I don't want to be made to look like a fool.
You have to rate it. Come on.
Okay, I'll rate Pliny the Elder 1 Jersey. Jersey the Elder would be better than Pliny the Elder.
Even after 20 years, Pliny the Elder maintains its position as probably my favorite double IPA. I'm not really one to get caught up in the hype or anything like that, so I'm confident that's not why I like it so much. I just think this beer is crazy good, and the fact that Jersey called it out by name, I don't have the words. I promise you he did not see me pour it out of the bottle, because that's not how, the way we have this set up, he wouldn't be able to see it. The fact that he nailed it just blows my mind.
Yeah, I have to question that. I want to see film. I want to see. I want a security perimeter put up. I think it's just one of the few double IPAs he knew.
Well, I don't think that's the thing. He didn't know he was drinking a double IPA.
Yeah, but it was like, okay, IPA, super piney. Piney rhymes with Pliny. I'm out.
And that part's funny. Piney the Elder. Yeah. The fact, though, that he called it, and he was so confident that that's what it was. I pour these things in a different area, so they can't see me do it. And Jersey is not a cheater. He would be annoyed with himself for doing that. When I showed them the bottle in awe, going, "What? How did you know that, dude?" He was shocked just as much as I was in his own abilities. So
is that ability or is that luck?
Yeah, I'm going to go with luck. But I'm sure that there are listeners out there who are with you. They don't trust that he didn't sneak a glance or something like that. But I'm telling you, I did everything I could to hide it from him, and I just think he got it. I think he got lucky though. It's not that he's just some crazy double IPA taster.
Well, I think just listening to them over the last 2 years, they've obviously, one, expanded their horizon, and two, their vocabulary. Although that's limited, but that's part of the shtick. But they do seem to be better tasters, the both of them, and they seem to have no longer had two types of beer, Coors Light and everything else.
Yeah.
So it's cool. It's cool to watch for sure.
Yeah, and I'll tell you though, man, just another kudos. You've had Russian River's Pliny the Elder, I imagine.
Oh yeah,
it's delicious. It's just an amazing beer, and to me, it just is the quintessential West Coast, big double IPA that's very drinkable. Still, I could drink it all day. I'm probably going to go pick up a couple of bottles here soon.
Just rub that into the rest of the country.
Well, if you want your beer or any other fermented beverage reviewed by Jersey and Tim, email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. When we return from this break, we'll be focusing on Session IPA. The brew in a bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAB experience, you have got to go with the brew bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the brew bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew in a bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a brew bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you, and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Exchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Exchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. It seems like every year a, quote, new style of beer takes the market by storm, and most tend to be more hop-focused. We've all seen variations of IPA like black, red, white IPA, but the one that appealed the most to me is Session IPA. Now, I've got my own presumptions as to how this style sort of came about, and I've developed some opinions about it over the years, but I'm curious if you know anything about the origins of Session IPA, Malcolm.
Well, as a term in the U.S., I think it started coming about as a marketing term. IPA in general, I think, has always been a marketing term, right? Because the beer that was or became the India Pale Ale, or the Pale Ale brewed for India, was being made for just going off the cuff, but 50 years,
Yeah.
Before it was actually called IPA, right? So then when it started to be associated with India and it had a selling point, people latch onto it. And I think that's what happens with a lot of beers. New England IPA was called a few different things, and now a lot of people will say hazy pale.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the group, the hive mind of the drinkers and the brewers kind of sit back and go, okay, what's catching on here?
Yeah. All
right. And then I go, oh, hazy resonates. Everyone call their beers hazy now, right?
Yeah.
IPA is that. So, if you have a problem selling a beer and it has some hops in it, just do a dash IPA, So a Session IPA, and a lot of people will just say, oh, that's a pale ale, or that's a British golden ale.
Right.
Or that's a hoppy blonde. Hoppy blondes were around in, 2000s, early 2000s.
Oh,
People
yeah.
were saying, I'm making a blonde. I remember I made a blonde and ran it through a Randall of Centennial and Cascade, and my friend just looked at me and rolled his eyes. He's like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
I'm like, trying to get rid of this beer.
I bet it was good though. I mean,
yeah. So pretty much the session modifier to IPA, I think, came about to signify lower alcohol, at least here in America.
Yeah.
Lower alcohol, but hoppy with not a lot of malt. That's what it means to me in a nutshell.
Yeah.
This is me in a nutshell. But the session strength beers had existed for, I want to say 80 years, 90 years over in England because
easily.
of tax laws and stuff, and economic pressure pushing the gravity down. So, starting in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you can go to Shut Up About Barclay Perkins, or as I like to call it, Barclay Perkins. Shh. But so it's more polite. It's much more British. So go look at some of his articles on Session IPA or not IPA, English IPA, and he'll show you a bunch that were in the 55 original gravity points range. So you almost have to go look at an entire brewery's portfolio and judge their beers against themselves, because you'll see some people will have a pale ale that's higher in alcohol and maybe even bittering amounts or hop amounts than their IPA, and vice versa. So you really have to look within a portfolio.
Yeah. So when I hear the term session, I think, highly drinkable, lower alcohol, balanced with no single overwhelming characteristic. When I think of a session IPA in particular, or session beers in particular, it's, you're getting, it's like a bitter, you've got that malty, but you still got that English hop. To me, a session IPA is distinguished by the fact that it is more hop focused, obviously, but it's also very pale and drinkable, but without being, I guess, insipid. It's still got flavor. It tastes like an IPA, just with lower booze. I remember when all of these session IPAs were starting to hit the market. I think it must have been 7 or 8 years ago. The first one I had was Lagunitas Daytime IPA. I was on vacation with my family down in Southern California, and I saw this stuff on the shelf going, oh, that sounds interesting. And I thought it was excellent. It tasted just like a normal IPA to me. But the defining characteristic there was that it was very hoppy, and you could drink a whole 12 pack and not really be hurting the next morning. It was so low in ABV, around, God, I think it was like 4.2%. So then all of the talk became around, well, isn't that just a pale ale? Why, isn't that just an American pale ale, which is basically a more moderate strength IPA? I don't think it is. I think a session IPA is different than a pale ale in two main ways. And this is, I know there's controversy, however controversial this can be, about this, but session IPA to me is always dry hopped. And it's always going to have that really hop punch that you get from a standard IPA, whereas pale ale has much more of a malt thing to it. A good classic American pale ale, you think of something like Sierra Nevada, their green label, that's got a nice malt backbone to it. It's also got that really strong, punchy hop character, but it doesn't necessarily need to be in your face hoppy, which is what I expect from a session IPA. Am I making any sense on this here, or am I?
I think that's in line with a lot of people's take. And what I would say is, as a general rule, that tends to be true. However, you could go to pick a brewery and look at their lineup, and you could say, well, their pale ales aren't very caramely and don't have a lot of malt flavor. So within that context, styles are only there to make it easier to explain what the beer is to a customer or your friends. That's the whole purpose of them, right? There's no law. There's no, at least not in this country, there's no Reinheitsgebot and saying like it's a Vol beer or it's you pretty much use the terms to convey generalities, and then you can add modifiers. Yeah. So I tend to agree. A pale ale tends to be a little more maltier. It tends to be not as hop focused. So if you're, home brewing terms, if you're using 1 or 2 ounces per gallon, maybe you're using 2 or 3 or 4 for, some more intensely hoppy beers. So if you're using like a half ounce to 2 ounces to dry hop a pale ale, an American pale ale, you're probably in the 3 to 4 or 5 ounces range to dry hop an IPA, typically, right?
Yeah.
Now if you want to walk it back for a session IPA, you probably reduce the crystal.
Or remove it altogether. I mean, I've seen Session
remove it
IPA
altogether,
that look like the grist is basically the same as what you would see in a classic West Coast IPA. No crystal malt, maybe a little bit of Vienna, maybe a touch of Munich or something. And then, the idea being that you don't want that to get in the way of the hop character, right? I mean,
yeah, but that always seems to be the best method of judging the brewer's art and his or her ability to balance the beer. Because I think what happens to a lot of session IPAs is they become insipid. They have no malt backbone, and they just taste like hop water. They're overly attenuated. They're too dry, and I like dry beers. So for me to say we're talking really, really attenuated beers.
yeah.
I think without any malt to support the hops, it just becomes bitter hop water, and that is not the hallmark of a sessionable beer. So now we're going the other side of sessionable. We're talking about its drinkability. The sessionability is not just strength. It should be, you should. I remember the first time I got the Bitter American from 21st Amendment. That was one of the first session IPAs. I think now it's sometimes called a pale ale. I don't really care, but I remember drinking it, going, "Wow, this is like 4.5% alcohol or whatever it was, and it's like 40 IBUs," and you put it down and you realize you drank half the can. That's a good beer.
Yeah, it's a delicious beer. I agree.
Yeah. So, and that's how I feel about All Day, Founders All Day.
Yep.
You're out in the backyard doing some yard work, or you're playing golf with your buddies, and you look over and you're like, uh-oh.
Yeah.
If you're drinking your beer so fast, you're going, uh-oh. Even at 4.5%, they're going to catch up to you.
Yeah.
That's a good thing.
I agree. And I to me, it's cool to have an alternative to, I love Miller Lite. People know that. I always have it on hand. But if I'm looking for something that is still, more crafty, that's more hop focused, that just tastes like a craft beer, to be able to go and grab an 18 pack of Founders All Day or of Firestone Walker's Easy Jack, I think that's awesome. It just in terms of the alternative aspect of it, I don't just have to go, either pour myself a cocktail or drink something that's just more refreshing. You're not getting weighed down by a big old IPA. I love it. Do you remember? This is making me think. There was a minute there for in the craft beer world where there was a like this style, again in air quotes here, called extra pale ale or XPA. People were calling it XPA.
Sounds familiar, but I do get what you're saying. I think I recall it, but like you said, it was a blip.
It was a blip, and I'm wondering if maybe because the one XPA locally that I had, it was by Tioga Sequoia Brewing. I think they called it Mount Whitney XPA or something. It was actually pretty good, and I'm trying to remember if it was lower ABV as well. But to me, it shares a lot of the same characteristics. That extra pale, you're not adding any of those darker crystal malts to it.
I think Sweetwater made one. I just remember a lot of older breweries. Not like ones that have been around a while.
Yeah,
so like Summit, and I could have swore that Kona made like an extra pale.
I think so.
There.
Yeah,
but I remember Sweetwater had an extra pale in Summit, but I almost just really thought of it as a pale ale.
Yeah, me too.
Maybe not as much crystal.
Yeah, but I do wonder if it wasn't sort of the what started the uphill climb to this new Session IPA thing, which has stuck around. I mean, you still see All Day, Founders All Day, and Firestone Walker's Easy Jack, a daytime IPA lining the shelves in the stores. So people are drinking it and people enjoy it. Let's talk a little bit. This is kind of one of those non-style styles, right? It's not explicitly discussed in the BJCP guidelines, but let's go through and talk about in terms of things like the appearance and aroma and flavor, what you'd expect in a good example of a Session IPA.
I wanted to say two things. One, we'll get to that, but also I want to say if you have an extra pale ale that's delicious and you want to sell, call it a Session IPA.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. That was my point with that. Is that I feel like people are like, this whole XPA thing's not landing, so let's call it a Session IPA. Yeah. And there it goes, boom, it's still around. So.
So the hallmarks to me, if you're going to add the word session, is drinkability. So there should be some malt. It shouldn't just be 2-row. And I'm not saying a brewer is not able to make just a 2-row Session IPA delicious, because I think you can mess with the mashing regime, or if you had malts like, we'll get to your short and shoddy version of it, you used Mecca. Well, Mecca Great Estate malts are very flavorful, and it's been a while since I've had them, so I definitely need to revisit them, to be fair. But they always seem to have all the flavors that you read about for a pale malt or a Vienna malt.
Yeah.
It's theirs is always dialed up by intensity 1 or 2.
Amplified, exactly.
Yeah,
That's my
it's
experience
just like
with it as well.
Like the Swan malt or Swain, however you say that. Their malts are similar in that they are just more intense. So I think you could probably do a very basic, smash type session IPA, but I tend to see most people putting a little bit of Munich, a little bit of Vienna, or a little something, maybe using some British malts.
Right.
Just so it is not overly bitter hop water.
Yeah.
So the hallmarks to me, they tend to be a little bit lighter than most pale ales. Go pour a Sierra Nevada pale ale. It's a light copper.
Yeah.
The session IPAs tend to be anywhere from yellow to deep orange. And you will see a few that range in the copper, light copper. But I find that most session IPAs are drank from a can because of it's an occasion-based drink for me.
Yep.
Just using some of that corporate-y beer terms. It's an occasion-based drinking is a segment that, people who sell beer talk about because they know that session IPAs are going to appeal to like a beachgoer, a camper.
That's right.
A picnic, a pool party.
Yeah.
So you drink it in the can, and you're not really paying attention to the color as much. So most of the stuff you're doing to it is for flavor only and not as much for appearance. Now, you should still make a nice looking beverage because people will pour it in a can, but into a glass. But the hallmarks to me are, some malt, just enough to support the hops, enough malt character and some residual sweetness. And we're talking just a flick to hold up to, somewhere between 40 and 50 IBUs. It should be drinkable. You should almost be alarmed by how fast you're drinking it.
That's me
really.
in most beers, dude. I got to be honest,
Yeah.
but I agree with you. You want it to be refreshingly, that you keep coming back to it. When I think of session IPA, the ones that I've had tend to be, like you said, these pared down versions of either a common IPA or really a pale ale that just has an amplified hop note to it. Now, in terms of the appearance, I've started to see in the beginning it was brilliant clarity. It was basically like miniature versions of Union Jack or a miniature version of Lagunitas IPA. They were just taking out some of that booze and trying to keep that balance there, that nice good IPA flavor. Nowadays I'm seeing a lot of, and I think this is cool. I'm not dissing this. I'm seeing a lot of session and then add your descriptor here and then IPA. So you've got session hazy IPA, session black IPA,
Sure.
session red IPA.
It's all modifiers.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
And so this, like I said, this is kind of one of those non-style styles. And so if somebody out there is really in love with that old style that people were making 10 years ago called red IPA, pare it down. I think red IPA would be an easy one to get away with, easier than a standard pale IPA for sessionizing because you are using more flavorful malts, right? So you're gonna kind of go away from that fear of making this watery or hop water mess that doesn't taste very good because you do have that malt backbone to kind of hold up those hops.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I can't think of an example off the top of my head of a sessionable red, because one of the things I associate with a red is it is kind of has that marshmallowy, intense biscuit malt. Mm-hmm. So I wonder how that would work. That'd be kind of neat.
Yeah.
So another thing with those, just like a red IPA, is that it has the quintessential Northwestern hops, and most of them I do see are in the Centennial, Mosaic, Cascade.
Yep. The popular stuff.
Realm.
Yeah.
But not so much super sexy hops, cheater hops. Mosaic is kind of popular, but I don't see as many session IPAs with like Galaxy or
Citra, or I know either do I. I see a lot of the classic Cascade, Centennial, Simcoe, Amarillo. I had a session IPA when I was up in Yakima last year that was made with Brew One. That was really a really great one because that Brew One has that ability to kind of impart multiple characteristics. So even as a single hop, it works really well. But typically what I'm seeing in session IPA recipes and what I'm tasting in this commercial session IPA that I drink is that classic Northwest, piney / grapefruity citrus hop character.
Yeah. I know at Fatheads we used Mosaic, Chinook, and Citra, I think, and maybe one other one. It's right on the website. You can go find it. But in Sunshine Daydream, which I think is a good session IPA. It's very popular around here. So in our area, Sunshine Daydream is our all day.
That's awesome. Yeah,
it's really, really popular. And one of the first things people said to me when I was with Fatheads, and they'd say, "Oh, I love Sunshine Daydream. I love Sunshine Daydream." So that's a very sessionable beer, and it's, definitely showcases those Northwest classic hops.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it works so well in anything with those letters IPA in it. So,
IPA. I think it's from the Latin root word IPA, which means "by me." So yeah, I mean, really, IPA just nowadays. Like I said, IPA has always been a market term. It was a market term back when, October ales and pale ales for India became IPA.
Yeah.
Well, it's a marketing term now more so than ever.
Yeah.
Quite literally, you can have the same beer and you call one a hoppy blonde, you call one a session IPA or an extra pale. Session IPA will get bought.
It's going to sell. Yeah. I made a stout that I'm just going to call black IPA because it'll sell. So
there you go.
Yeah.
It's a low hopped black IPA.
There you go. Exactly. A little more malt forward.
Put low hopped like in smaller font and in parentheses.
Yeah. There you go. Well, in terms of fermentation, the yeast that one might use when fermenting IPA, I think it's pretty standard to go with something like the Chico strain, Imperial Yeast A07 Flagship, or WLP 001. Other popular strains that I've used in making pale ale and IPA, which I think would work really well for a session IPA, are things like the I believe it's the Boddington strain. That's A38 Juice, or that's the popular one for New England IPA. Works beautiful. And another one is the Fuller strain. I believe actually that is used by Firestone Walker in all of their hoppy ales. And I love it. It's probably my favorite yeast, even though it's an English in origin. My favorite yeast for American style hoppy beers. And so that's kind of what I've been doing. And also, it doesn't attenuate as low. So for something like a session IPA, to have that residual body left behind, you're not drying it out so much that it, again, it just washes right off your palate, leaving weird hop flavor.
Yeah, I would caution the use of using an overly estery English. I mean, you can make it work for sure, and I love golden ale, and I will use a low character English yeast for that, and I will treat it such that I want to hold the esters in check. So I'll pitch higher, ferment slightly cooler, that kind of thing. So that's another discussion. When does session IPA begin and golden ale stop?
Yeah, no,
but
God.
So I do think you can use an English strain as long as it's restrained esters.
Yeah.
And you don't go too thick in body, because then you lose the other side of the sessionability. I would not use like a Whitbread or something like that, because that tends to have a lot more apple pear, cherry candy to me. So, I would think like 002, our English dry, could be, whatever the equivalents of those are. So 007, 002. That's just my take. I think California ale works best, for these beers, but it can over attenuate at times.
Yeah, well, I think you're referring to the Whitbread dry strain. Imperial calls it A01 House. It's that English dry strain, and it's I've used that for a standard IPA, and I'm telling you, I didn't get the esters produced by. Now I ferment at 66F, which is 19C, so I keep it restrained. But I didn't taste the esters from that yeast strain getting in the way of the hop character. I felt like it almost amplified it a little bit. So I like the way that works. In fact, somebody was telling me that Stone uses that yeast, some version or isolate of that yeast for their IPA as well. I really enjoy it. A09 Pub though, that's the Fuller strain from Imperial Yeast, is just money with these hoppy beers. So now, okay, this is something that I've heard when it comes to like water chemistry for a session IPA. This is something that I know people have pretty strong opinions about. I tend to prefer a higher sulfate to chloride ratio in anything pretty much any beer that I brew, but particularly for hoppy beers. The sole purpose being to enhance that crispness and that hop character. There are some people who say that when you're going low ABV like this and you're not using as much malt as a means of getting that lower ABV, that can actually lead to this thinness, perceived thinness in the beer.
I completely agree, actually. I think you should build in some calcium chloride and reduce some of your sulfate, because I think it will make it dry and almost rough on the palate.
Yeah.
I've found even in some commercial beers, when they're not taking that into account, we always talk about the BU to GU ratio,
Yeah.
right? I think there should be like a total gypsum to FG ratio. I really believe that, because I find if you're going with these traditional West Coast gypsum rates, but you peel a lot of the malt out. So if you peel a lot of like Maris Otter out of your original recipe, if you peel more crystal out, which is what we're doing here on purpose,
Yeah.
I think, in my opinion, the drinkability and the mouthfeel suffers.
I get where you're coming from, and it's weird for me because if I'm making a Pilsner, I'm still favoring that higher sulfate because I like what it does. To me, it enhances that drinkability, but it makes sense with a style like Session IPA and the way that they're being brewed, that you would want to maybe go 1-to-1 ratio with sulfate to chloride, as opposed to, I think a lot of us are doing like 3-to-1 for our hoppy beers.
Right. So I think 1-to-1 would be on the low side for me, because I do want it to be still, snappy and crispy.
Right.
So, maybe 1.5, I'm just throwing this out there.
Sure.
So like 1.5-ish, and maybe keep the total minerality down, because that's why I start thinking beers get salty, and not necessarily like table salt, just I guess minerally.
Yeah, chalky. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Chalky.
Yeah.
So instead of it being in the 300s, for your gypsum, your sulfate, I should say, I would get it down to like 100, 150, for me.
Yeah. No, I like that. I think that's good.
That's going to depend on how you balance it with other stuff. If you're one to peel out all the caramel and not use English malts, then you have to consider that. To take more out. If you're going to layer in some, Munich and Victory in some, C pills or C15, then build in, that's the brewer's art. That's palate balance. That's making it sessionable.
Yeah, I'm going to take that tip for the next time I make a Session IPA when it comes to water chem, because I've always done the higher sulfate. Now, in terms of mash, the mash regime and the way that you mash a lower ABV beer like this, you think about your standard IPA, and I don't know about you, Malcolm, but when I'm making an IPA that I'm planning to 1066 or higher OG, I'm mashing that thing at 148 to 152 degrees Fahrenheit, typically no warmer than that. When it comes to Session IPA, one of the ideas that I've had was that if you bump up that mash temperature, you're not going to get as dry of a beer in the end, but that should allow you to add a bit more malt. And I've heard others messing around with that as well.
I just don't find a few degrees makes a huge difference for most base malts on the homebrew scale.
Sure.
I just find that somewhere between 148 and 155, it just goes to limit attenuation. Now, that's not the case for everyone. I can't speak to your brew system, but I know on the pro side, I see more ability to adjust. I have seen more ability to adjust. For me, it just seems, unless I'm using a less modified malt for the purpose of giving you control. So I would say like a German Pilsner malt, for example, and some of the British ones, but some of the British ones seem to be very enzymatic too. It's like you put it in, it gets wet. If it's wet and warm, man, it's ripping and roaring, ready to go. So it just goes, and there's lots of jokes there, and sorry, but you can go right down to 1010 or whatever that is, 2.5, Plato.
Yeah.
In a snap, it just seems like 15, 20 minutes. And I think you've seen that more or less with the short and shotties, right?
Yeah.
That just goes so fast.
Yeah, it does. Now this is one of those styles where typical 60-minute boil is pretty much called for. And for me, in terms of the kettle hop additions, I'm doing for a Session IPA, I'm doing the same thing I would an IPA. I might toss in a bittering addition. Now I'm going to bitter a bit lower for a Session IPA than I would for a more malty standard IPA. I like to start somewhere around the 10 to 15 IBU range at that bittering addition, and then get the rest of that isomerized bitterness from late additions, usually 10 minutes or less. This goes for regular IPA as well. I still like to throw in a 30-minute, quote unquote flavor addition of something like Fuggles or, Willamette at that halfway mark. There's something about it to me that I think, and we should test this out, but I think it kind of adds this savory component to the finished beer. So that's the way I do it. Again, you're gonna bitter it the way that you want to.
Yeah. So I've mentioned previously, one of the things I've come around to from being at Fatheads and actually talking to the guys at Terrapin too. Spike from Terrapin, he's a more traditional old school brewer in a lot of ways. I've come around to the idea that there is a potential for both mouthfeel and this, something you can't explain, je ne sais quoi, however for that mid edition. And it kind of makes sense, even though I'm not one to completely buy into tradition for the sake of it.
Yeah.
But those brewers have been doing it for a long time and probably for a reason.
Yeah.
And it just seems to add something. And I don't know if it's necessary. I don't know if it's needed in all beers, but I tend to like it. So I do like to have a little bit in the middle. And I'd be perfectly willing to test something like that or have someone tell me that I'm full of crap, because that's what's fun is learning, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I would like to see a beer, obviously adjusted for IBUs, with a 30 and without it. And I'm sure I've tasted them. I just can't recall.
Yeah.
I could have swore we did a tasting with James from Basic Brewing.
We did something on the different hop timings, but they were separated. It wasn't specifically a test of whether that mid edition, what we used to call flavor addition, has an impact. But I still like you, I still do it. I stopped doing it for a while. I felt like I was missing something, and then when I went back and I always use a more earthy hop in the middle. That it's just my thing, and I like what it does, so that's what I do. Now, obviously, this is an IPA. It's just a lower ABV version, so we're going to dry hop this. And I think you have to have kind of a steady hand. You got to pull back a little bit, maybe not throw a gazillion pounds of dry hops at this, because it will get more easily than a bigger IPA with all of that, the body and the malt. To me, it's really easy to over dry hop one of these and ultimately get that kind of green, grassy, in my opinion, not very pleasant dry hop character.
I completely agree there too, which is making me uncomfortable.
I know, man. I
agree
know
with you so much. But I have done British Golden Ales and Session IPAs as low as a half ounce per 5 gallons. Up to about an ounce. And I won a competition with one that was literally half ounce of Citra, and it had an amazing aroma. Now I did it under pressure and well evacuated, so I thought I treated it fairly well as far as oxygen went. And I transferred it closed too. But that beer had punch. It had an aroma punch.
Yeah.
And I do think you can go overboard on dry hopping with these smaller beers. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I agree. And actually I want to hit on something when it comes to the malt that you can use in these beers. But I made a rye pale ale that I ended up, thinking back, it was like 4.8% ABV. It had really nice body because of the beta glucans that the rye contributes. And I felt like the rye character, I've said this before, I don't perceive rye as being spicy. But that really contributed to it. I think I added 1 ounce of something like Citra or Galaxy in the dry hop, and it was hoppy. I mean, I don't know how else to explain it. It was way more hoppy than you would expected from that amount of dry hop. So I agree with you on that. I think otherwise, in terms of making a session IPA, you're going to package it. I like it well carbonated. This is an American style ale. Make it fizzy. That's what we like out here. And serve it up. Again, appearance can be whatever you want it to be. In this day and age, people like their hazy IPAs. Try to get the yeast out of the way, because that can have issues in your body. But other than that, they're pretty simple to make as long as you're, working to keep that body there so that it's not a watery mess. Well, I've tried my hand at brewing session IPA a few times. Some have turned out great while others not so much, usually because of this lack of balance we've been talking about. As I was pondering ways to improve my session IPAs a couple years ago, I came up with some ideas based on prior experiment results and brewed what ended up being a short and shoddy version. More on that when we return.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD, at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort, from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature, in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. If it isn't apparent yet, I really, really like full-flavored beers with restrained alcohol content, so Session IPA was right up my alley. In my first few batches, the biggest issue I had, one that I think is shared by a lot of people out there, is that the beers ended up being kind of thin and uninteresting to the point of being almost hop water. Not very good. In thinking of ways to improve this, I referenced some past experiments and came up with a short and shoddy recipe I thought would do the trick. Now, I brewed this one using the full volume brew in a bag method. I started at 8:27 a.m. on the dot by collecting the full volume of filtered water. I always filter my water, as unshoddy as that may be. I don't like chlorine in my beer. And then I lit the flame under my kettle to get the water heating up. At this point, I added a fairly large mound of gypsum. I left out all the calcium chloride. Again, this was about 2 years ago. And I thinking back, I'm going, all right, I can understand why you might want to have more of a balanced water profile for this. But at this time, it was just a nice unmeasured amount of gypsum. I add this stuff to beer all the time, so I know about what it looks like. I proceeded to weigh out and mill the grains while the water was heating up. Now, the grain bill for this one, like you said, Malcolm, I used all Mecca Grade Estate malts, which are maximum flavor malts is how I like to think of them. They impart so much malt flavor to beer. I went with 82% La Manta, that's their pale ale malt, 12% Venora, that's their Vienna malt, and then 6% Metolius, that's their Munich malt. I relied on that Venora and the Metolius for the malt character piece of it, because I really didn't want this to turn out being, again, this insipid, hop water thing. And I thought by putting those character malts in it like that, it would amplify that malt character. I mean, we talked about it earlier. That's definitely something you see as being a potential benefit for this style, right, Malcolm?
A benefit, but you have essentially 18% of Mecca grade character malts, and I think they can be used more judiciously.
Yeah.
So I would have, knowing that, I probably would have went lower. This looks like it could have been a pretty good British pale, very biscuity to me. And even go looking at the descriptions for those two malts, what's the Munich?
Metolius, yeah.
Robust warming malt profile, liquid toasted graham cracker.
Yeah.
I would have that to me sounds English, even though it's a Munich. But what's the other one? Even the La Manta. I mean, I've had that. That tastes almost like a Golden Promise to me.
It sure does. Yeah.
So it's intense, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if you can get it to dry out and you use a lower estery yeast. So as long as you get it to dry out and use a low ester yeast, this beer should be fine.
So we've done multiple experiments on mash temperature, and in those experiments, not a single one has returned a significant result, meaning that tasters can't tell apart beers that are mashed at widely different, mash temperatures. So, you take one that's mashed somewhere down at the 148 range, which I think is like 68 or 69 C, up to 165, which is like 74 C. People can't tell them apart, despite the fact that they are massively different in terms of their alcohol content. So running with that and kind of referencing those experiments, I thought, well, I don't want this beer to be lacking in malt character. So if I mash it really warm, I should be able to get away with adding about the same amount of malt that I would for a pale ale, and again, amplify that malt character while still keeping that ABV restrained. So I mashed this beer at 165 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 74 C, and I only did it for 20 minutes. By the end of that 20 minutes, it was about as fully converted as it's going to be. My whole hope was that it wouldn't attenuate as well, so that I would keep that ABV in check. Now, I removed the grain bag after those 20 minutes. I let it drip while the wort was heating up, and then I only boiled the wort for 30 minutes. So right now, I mean, just those two processes alone were in less than an hour. The hop additions for this one, sit back. There's a lot of hops that went into this bad boy. I did 13 grams of Horizon for a first wort hop, so that was right at the 30-minute mark, or prior to it reaching a boil. I then added 15 grams each of 2014 Citra and 2015 Comet at 10 minutes. I added 40 grams of that Comet plus 30 grams each of Citra and California grown Chinook at 2 minutes. I didn't do a hop stand. Now, a note on these hops. These had been sitting in the back of my freezer. I kind of forgot I had them. I think some food got in the way blocked my view of them. So I just figured, hey, this is short and shoddy. I might as well see how these things turn out. They were in my freezer. It's a big deal. A couple of the bags had lost their seal, so they weren't very well sealed. So arguably oxygen could have gotten in there, though. Again, they were in my freezer. So, well, after the boil, I chilled the wort to a few degrees above groundwater temperature, which at the time of year that I was brewing this ended up being 71 degrees Fahrenheit or 22 degrees Celsius. Refractometer readings showed that the OG was at 1048, which to me, not too bad for a Session IPA, especially if it didn't ferment too low. I think that put me at a efficiency of somewhere around 60%.
Yeah, that's right in line, I think you were kind of crazy with that mash temperature.
Yeah. I did too, but that's why I wanted to try it, because I'd had this theory.
Yeah.
After those mash temperature experiments, I had this theory. Hey, you probably get away with having nice malt character in a lower ABV hoppy ale just by mashing high. So,
do you take out your hops and rub them before you put them in your beer? Because you said these are 2014 Citra. Did you? Put them in your hand, get them.
Absolutely. Yeah. They smelled great. They smelled great out of the freezer. Yes. I always do that. I don't care if they're brand new or if they're 2 years old. I always check them out. Now, I did another weird thing here, and we've got an experiment on this one. Before racking the wort to the fermentation vessel, I measured out the dry hop addition, which was 25 grams of that same Comet and 20 grams each of California grown Chinook from Golden State hops and 20 grams of Citra, that 2014 Citra. I added all of that to a stainless mesh sleeve, put it in the empty Spidell fermentation tank, and then I racked the wort on top of that. So we've done an experiment on fermenting on the dry hop charge. I forget what the exact results were, but I'm pretty sure people couldn't distinguish it from one that was dry hopped more traditionally. So I figured, hey, what the hell? Might as well try it out. I then pitched a single pouch of 5-month-old Imperial Yeast A31 Tartan, which I believe is the McEwen strain, or what's commonly used to ferment Scottish-style ales. Not terribly common for IPA, but in my experience, or at least I thought in my experience, it was a clean, a less estery yeast. Plus, it's all that I had on hand at the time. And again, short and shoddy, we take what we have and try to make these beers. What are your thoughts on fermenting pale ale, American style hoppy beers, whatever, with this Scottish style yeast?
I don't prefer it. Now, there was a Scottish ale yeast I liked for pale ales, the English pale ales, and I can't remember which one it was. But Bellhaven to me has a phenol.
I agree.
So I don't know, So people say, "Oh, there's no peat in Scottish beer," and I believe them. And I believe the research done by some beer historians. But if you give me a Bellhaven, I will peg it as having a smoky phenolic every time. Now, it's a wisp. It's just a wisp, but it's there. And I've heard tales of it being the water, the malt, or the yeast, and I tend to think it's the yeast.
I've used this same strain to ferment other beers, and I always get that whisper of smoke as well. And it's very, and I know what you're saying. People constantly, I've heard people say up and down, professionals in yeast labs, there's nothing peaty about it. There's no smoke in this yeast. I'm telling you, it does something that imparts some sort of a smoke character. I forgot about that when I used this yeast and was just hoping that the hop character would overwhelm any, that whisper of smoke or phenol. So,
although that is a good lean towards them. People say, "Oh, I think people load up on hops to cover, issues." Well, yeah. You need a lot more hops than what you just did, and that's a lot of hops.
Yeah.
So, I think it's a cop-out usually. So I don't think you can just load up a beer with lots of hops and forget about a poor fermentation.
No, it's like when somebody lets one loose in the bathroom and then you just spray flowery perfume. It smells like a flowery
dipped in shit.
Yeah, exactly. A flowery turd. So that's how I think of it. But I fermented this beer at 66 degrees Fahrenheit, 19 degrees C, my standard ale fermentation temperature. It was wintertime, so I actually had to keep it in the chamber so it wouldn't get too cold. I finished around 10:42 p.m. for a total brew day length of 2 hours and 15 minutes. I had another 15 on there for cleanup time. So it was pretty good. After 8 hours, usually I'm seeing a lot of activity when I pitch a single pouch of imperial yeast. At this point, I noticed no noticeable signs of fermentation, which I just presumed was because of the old yeast. I was getting a little bit scared that maybe it wasn't going to work at all. But a few hours later, I returned. Airlock was bubbling. My worries were quelled. With fermentation activity was absent after just 6 days. Again, that lower FG, I expect it to be done pretty quick. I took a hydrometer measurement showing that the beer did exactly what I was hoping. It finished at 1018 FG. That's awesome because 1048 OG down to 1018 FG means a 4% ABV, which is perfect in my opinion for a Session IPA, nice and low, should be really drinkable. I swapped out the airlock for a CO2 filled balloon, also balloon lock, TM, and I cold crashed it to 34 degrees Fahrenheit or 1C. I started that, I think it was like 11 o'clock in the morning, and then I came back a couple hours later and added the gelatin fining because I wanted this beer to clear up, look nice and pretty. I let it sit overnight on the gelatin fining, and then I racked the beer the following day to a CO2 purged keg and burst carbonated it at 50 PSI for 14 hours before I reduced the gas to serving pressure and let it sit another 4 days, which is when I started serving it to tasters. Now, I started drinking this beer early on, like while it was still fermenting. I was pulling out samples and I tasted the FG sample. And to me, I was pretty excited. I mean, I couldn't wait for the carbonation to kick in on this guy. When I poured that first pint, I was a little bit disappointed with the way it looked. I was expecting it to be a lot more clear than it was. It still had a noticeable haze. But otherwise, it looked fine. Color and foam were spot on. It wasn't darkening, so I wasn't concerned about oxidation. You seen the photos, Malcolm?
I think it looks kind of poo.
That was my lighting.
Yeah, okay. It just has an odd... I do think that beers that go past orange and more start leaning into the reddish copper hues, when they're hazy, they don't look so yummy to me.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that Metolius, I've used that upwards. I believe I did 100% Metolius beer one time. And it has that orange, that really orange Munich character to it, almost bordering on that burnt orange kind of red color. And I think it contributed in kind of a darker color that I wasn't expecting to be there. But it was in line with what I'd expect based on the grist. So I wasn't worried. It didn't look oxidized is what I'm saying.
It looks to me like a tweener, like fest beer, but not quite
Yep.
American Oktoberfest. It looks kind of like a Vienna color.
Yeah. No, it does. I agree. But otherwise, again, it didn't look like there was going to be any issues with it. So this is where things get a little bit interesting. Like I said, I'd been tasting this beer for a while, and I was pretty hopeful that it was going to be good. And all the hops that I used were, cheater hops. I got Citra, I got Comet, I got that California Chinook, which we did a Hop Chronicles on. It was fantastic. I'm not sure what it was, but this beer was horrendous. To my palate, it had this odd sharpness in flavor and it wasn't like a bitterness. It was this weird, sharp flavor component that just stole the show. Any of the fruitiness from the hops that I was tasting or smelling during fermentation didn't come through at all. And I got this, I hate that it's aligned with my bias here. I got this weird phenolic smoky thing out of it that was just ruined the beer. It was disgusting, in my opinion.
Yes, if you didn't know that it was a Scottish ale strain, lack of hop punch, and the phenolic would make me think contamination, because a lot of contaminations will rob hop flavor.
Absolutely, and so there is. I'm not prideful enough to say that this wasn't a contaminated batch. It may have been.
But it also sounds like oxidation. Because oxidation. That's
what I'm saying. There's like three possibilities here. There's no way for us to determine exactly. But I'm sitting here going, maybe also I'm just being hard on myself, and this beer isn't as bad as I think it is. Now, because for the sake of science, I had to serve this to a few people. We usually try to get between 15 to 20 for these short and shoddy tasting things when it's not COVID time. I got to 12 people, and I felt so bad that I ended up stopping.
Stop the suffering.
Stop the suffering.
Just put your mask back on. Don't drink it.
That's why people would avoid drinking it. They don't want to take their mask off. Good excuse. The look on the people's faces who were tasting this beer just said everything I needed to know, that I wasn't wrong. This beer was bad. I've made beers that are I've had very few contaminations, but the few that I've messed around with that have an obvious contamination, or where I've done an experiment that obviously contaminated the beer, this didn't have that what I've perceived in those beers. It didn't have that. It really was like this weird, subtle. We talk about oxidation as imparting this weird, like hard candy flavor to IPA. It didn't even have that. It didn't have that weird oxidized smell that immediately pushes you away from it. It had this smoky thing. So I'm open to it being a contamination, and that somewhere in my fermentation vessel or whatnot got a contaminant got in there, some bug got in there. I'm not convinced it wasn't because of the old yeast being stressed out and potentially producing more phenolics. If that yeast does indeed produce even a whisper of phenolics when pitched at adequate rates, this was a massive underpitch. I mean, 5 months old. So that's kind of, if it wasn't a contamination, I'm going with the yeast. If it wasn't the yeast or a contamination, I'm going with the old hops. That was kind of my line of thinking on this one.
So it might not when it's adequately pitched, healthy and robust, but if it's stressed, or if you underpitch, or if you go high in temperature, whatever, if you add these stressors, under oxygenate, whatever, then you can get this character. There's a few yeast that are that way, notably Belgian yeast. You can tweak a few things and completely change the way the beer is presented.
Well, I've used tartan multiple times in Scottish ale or English style beers. And I still think, again, I'm biased, so it could be that, but I still think I get that whisper of smoke. It was just massively amplified in this potentially contaminated Session IPA, which I was bummed out. Now, I served these beers to those 12, poor souls, prior to making the change in the survey where we actually informed tasters of the style they're drinking. So the first question they were asked was, what style of beer do you think this is? And boy, were we all over the map on this one.
Yeah, everyone picked a different style. That's awesome.
Yeah, 2 people, that was the max. 2 people agreed that it was a wood-aged beer. 1 person each endorsed International Pale Lager, Munich Helles, American Pale Ale. Hey, that's close. American IPA, whoa. Belgian IPA, a rye IPA, okay. Wild specialty beer, that's probably what I would have said. Fruit and spice beer, spice, herb, or vegetable beer. And 1 person put specialty smoked beer. So, yeah.
Well, but here's what's telling to me, okay? So I know this is not super rigorous, not super scientific, it's not controlled to a degree that would make this more valid. But if I were to look at this casually, and go, hey, Belgian IPA, rye IPA, wild specialty, fruit and spice, spice herb, smoked and wood aged. That all to me, those all say phenolic to me.
Contamination to me. That's what it says.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah.
So, they weren't all over the map like, blonde, lager, a bunch of these malty, characterful, biscuity, beers. They were all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them said it had a phenolic character of some sort or spice.
Yep. I'm right there with you, man. In terms of how hoppy, malty, and dry the beer was, tasters seemed to perceive the strongest characteristic as being the beer's dryness, which is kind of funny because it was 1018 FG. I think that just goes to show that perception of dryness does not necessarily correlate with FG. And that yielded an average rating of about 3.8 out of 5. Hoppy came second. I don't know how that happened, but it was pretty close to the third rated malty. For a session IPA, you don't expect those ratings. I mean, I'd expect the hoppiness to be the highest, dryness to be number 2, and then the malt to come third. But this beer was just so awkward and weird that it makes sense that the dryness, the attenuation component of it is what people perceived as being the strongest, and the hops just weren't there. So that makes sense. In terms of a characteristic breakdown, hop character, 7 out of 12 people thought the most prominent hop characteristic was earthy. In a session IPA. What a joke. And then the other 5 out of 12. I mean, this was the weirdest. Usually we see it spread out a little bit more. The other 5 said it was pine resinous. Now that makes sense to me. There was this, never in a beer that I've brewed have I gotten a resinous characteristic, like a sappy resin kind of grossness. Considering the hops that I used, again, Citra, I mean, maybe it was that those 2014 Citra had just lost their oomph, but I used a lot of it, and it did not come through in this beer.
I think Cali Chinook, though, is resinous. It's piney.
Well, so regular Chinook really is resinous and piney. When we did the Hop Chronicles on the California Chinook, it tasted a lot more like Centennial to me than it does your typical like Northwest Chinook. So I don't know if that's where it came from. It could have. I mean, it absolutely could have. I really don't know. But that resinous component was what I perceived as being the strongest. Now, in terms of malt character, 4 out of 12 people said it was cracker bread crust. 4 felt it was nutty. And then 2 more rated the malt character as being roasty, while 1 identified toasty. I think people were just confused, and at this point going, I don't effing know. Just pick one of these things. But I probably would have said something like nutty. I got that as well from that. If I was capable of just focusing on the malt character, I would have probably said either nutty or toasty, because that seemed to be what I got the most out of it.
Yeah, the cracker bread makes a lot of sense with a lot of Mecca malts because they are flavorful. I think they would be amazing for a lot of English session beers, to be honest. The roast thing, I wonder if that's the phenol again, and people are just pegging roast because you didn't put any roast in it.
Nope. And I get why they would rate that. It did have that, what I thought was a kind of a spicy phenolic, and wait till we get to the yeast character here. 5 out of 12 people agree. They thought phenolic was the most prominent fermentation characteristic in this beer. 3 felt sulfur was. I didn't get that at all. 2 thought it was clean. They're crazy too. And then 1 each endorsed wild, fermentation character and esters. Again, I don't know if this had to do with the tartan yeast being old, but like I said, I've had that experience in the past with just a subtle smokiness. I felt like the phenolic was a bit too strong in this beer to have been just from, if it was a healthy pitch of that yeast. So again, either contamination or underpitching with an old yeast strain. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think the next preference rating kind of says it all.
0 out of 12 people gave it a 5 out of 5. That's a first. Usually we get one person who absolutely loved these beers. 1 person rated it a 4 out of 5.
That was your wife.
That was she doesn't take these surveys. 0 rated it a 3 out of 5. 4 people gave it a 2 out of 5. 4 gave it a 1 out of 5, and the 3 homies gave it a 0 out of 5. That's what I would have given it if I'm being honest. It was nasty. And then on top of that, we had 2 tasters note an astringent off flavor, and then 1 person each endorsed metallic, acetaldehyde, diacetyl, and alcoholic. I mean, this was just a mess of a beer, I'm telling you. And again, trying to keep myself humble, I had to serve it to people for the sake of, I didn't make a good beer here, and people need to, I guess, I thought people might be able to learn from it.
I admire you for putting it through the the panel anyways. Poor people.
Well, so the last question we ask is how well does this beer represent the style that it was intended to be? You know, it's Session IPA. 0 out of 12 thought a 5 out of 5. 1 gave it a 4 out of 5. I don't know what they were thinking. 2 each endorsed 3 and 2 out of 5. 6 people felt it was a 1 out of 5, and 1 person gave it the old goose egg with a 0 out of 5. Again, I would have been one of the ones giving it a 0 out of 5 myself. It didn't taste like an IPA at all. It tasted like a weird, phenolic, gross mess. And I personally don't think it was the brewing process that had anything to do with the way this beer turned out. I think somewhere along the line, either a contaminant got in or using that old Scottish ale yeast had some sort of an impact that didn't meld well with the older hops or something like that. And you'll hear people constantly talk about producing beers with old hops that just didn't turn out well. I think a lot of what I've read kind of aligns with the way this beer turned out, and it just wasn't good.
I think it's a perfect example of how I like fish and I like ice cream, but I don't want fish ice cream. So you look at the ingredients and all of them look pretty good, but maybe they don't mesh together.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
You have a lot of stuff going on there, and it reminds me of like a homebrew recipe, a person who's starting to get more confident.
Yep.
And they enter a style and you have it and it's just like not working. And then you end up talking to the person at a homebrew club meeting later on, and you're going like, well, what made you think that? Like, why did you think you should use those malts in those ratios? And it's usually inexperience, and they're starting to get their confidence going and be more creative. So you have like this very malty, non-directional, malt bill with, characterful malts, and then you have a characterful yeast, and then you have all these crazy hops, some of them that would be really awesome.
Yeah.
But they just came together, and you made sardine ice cream.
Yeah, and it's honestly, it probably sardine ice cream would taste better than this beer, in my opinion. So it was icky. Now I just want one more comment, because to me, the experiment in my mind for this short and shoddy, that what I was really interested in was the impact that this really high mash temperature would have, and I was pleased with that outcome. So I do plan on making Session IPA and repeating this short and shoddy version of it in the future, and I will keep that component of it. I do think I'm going to resort to a cleaner fermenting yeast that's healthy and use fresher hops, because I think you put those things together and I think you got a winner here. And again, we've done the session, or we did the short and shoddy version of a regular IPA that came out excellent. So a lot of the same ideas were used there, just fresher hops and a better yeast. Now, we got a bunch of comments on this one, and I think some people had some good thoughts on it, so we're going to get to those real quick. James said, I had a similar experience with old hops, a technically good APA, which just tasted plain odd. Nevertheless, I have an APA in the fermenter right now, the sole purpose of which is to use up a freezer full of hops. I guess we'll see how that one turns out. Now, this was a couple years ago, so I'm sure James knows. But old hops, man, I mean, that is an issue for homebrewers. Yeah,
it's a big issue for smaller professional brewers now. There's so many more breweries, and they don't have the buying power. So sometimes if you're spot buying, you don't know how they were stored. You're not getting the best picks.
Yeah.
I really recommend, if you're small regional, and especially if you're tiny, like, in the barrels per batch range, try your hops if you can. You can't always, especially small people, you're buying a few pounds here and there. It's really tough,
Yeah.
But if you are buying through a local brewery, go buy and check them out, rub them, as I said, put your nose in there and smell them. Otherwise you're going to have this garlic bomb, or, if you're only a few barrel brewery, you're out like $50. Wah. But
yeah.
At the same time, that batch is gone.
Yeah, exactly. And you don't want to waste that batch. So fresh hops, man, and not, you the freshest ingredients possible is good. When it comes to hops and yeast, I think it's essential. And I'm with you there, James. So Will Allwart said, I read in Jennifer Talley's book, which is Session Beers Brewing for Flavor and Balance, that favoring calcium chloride in session beers over gypsum is preferred regardless of style. The reason being that sulfate states reportedly thin out the mouthfeel of the finished beer, especially in the presence of carbonation. He says, good job. Even if the beer came out bad, we often learn from our failures than our successes, excuse me. Will, we were talking about that earlier in the episode, that next time I make a Session IPA, you better believe I'm going to go with a 1-to-1 ratio, because I want to see how that calcium chloride, if it enhances that perception of mouthfeel and body in a beer that's ultimately lower in body, right?
Yeah, it's nice to see he's one of our more interactive listeners and readers. So, hey, Will, thanks for chipping in, man. And I agree with him. We mentioned it earlier on, so I won't go into it anymore. But yes, I agree.
Yeah. A little dose of calcium chloride with your gypsum to your session beers. So Corey White says, thank you for posting your failures along with your successes. It would have been easy to rationalize this was just due to old hops, yeast choice, or a poorly designed recipe, which likely was the problem, while not representative of Short and Shoddy, and not post it. Thanks for doing what you do. Hey, listen, Corey, I really have no shame. It's something that drives my friends and my wife nuts about me. Beer isn't really something that I'd say I'm terribly prideful about. I like beer because it tastes good and it's fun to experiment with in a safe way. Also, I think we can learn from other people's experiences. So why not share it?
I agree. Warts and all. You gotta show your ups and your downs.
That's right. Dave M says, I've made a couple of American IPAs with Scottish ale strains that also had a subtle smoky flavor. It wasn't unpleasant, but I wouldn't do it again. Well, there you have it, Malcolm. I'm telling you, other people have experienced this as well.
Well, that validates my beliefs, so I'm going with it.
Exactly. Confirmation bias. Yeah. No, but I do think it's interesting that there are other people out there who've experienced that,
Yeah, I definitely want to try it again.
Yeah.
I have my brewery just about set up now, so.
Yay. Final comment comes from Tyler. He said, I believe this is absolutely a result of old oxidized hops. I recently brewed an IPA using a massive dose of old hops. They were incredibly cheap for a reason, he says. And I found the initial samples quite tasty, but it turned into an awful, stale, astringent, bitter bomb within a couple days of being in the keg. Exactly what you've described. Although it's a huge bummer brewing a dumper, I'm relieved to see that you experienced the same issue I had, which somewhat validates my suspicions on what went wrong with my bad batch. Yeah, Tyler, again, we've talked about the three possibilities that I think it is, one of them being a contamination, the other one being the yeast, like it sounds Dave M may be presuming it is. But I'm again, the old oxidized hops. This may have been one of those cases where, the gestalt, everything coming together, the Short and Shoddy full version of it just didn't work out this time. I do think that it can work out. I just don't think using old hops and old yeast with the malt bill that I did is going, it led down this path, and we were displeased with the way it turned out.
Yeah, I think the Short and Shoddy method can work when most other practices are done well and done in a robust manner, so good practices, but that also relies on good ingredients, and we know Mecca makes great malt and Imperial makes great yeast, but you also have to treat them well.
Yep.
So it might have just been that.
I do think that's what it was. It was the amalgamation of these multiple factors that came together just to produce a crappy beer. And that's going to happen. And I'm glad we shared it because it sounds like other people can relate. None of us are perfect except for you, Malcolm. And that is...
Well, I like the fact that you got to use the word amalgamation because it's one of my favorite words.
It's fun to say, right? Well, that does bring us to the end of this Short and Shoddy episode on Session IPA. I think we covered the style fairly well. Do you have any final words before we finish up, Malcolm?
Yeah, I like the fact that you said I thought I was perfect. It's so completely BS because my wife reminds me. And my best friends do too.
Yeah.
So it's good to have you in my life to occasionally counter everyone else who knows me so well.
Yeah. Well, we love you, Malcolm, and we love all of you listeners as well. Don't forget, you can click the link in the description of this episode to read all about this Short and Shoddy Session IPA. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.